The knock on the door came like a hammer against wood, and Aloan Hart knew before she opened it that her life was about to change forever. 3 men stood outside the small townhouse, and the tallest of them held a folded paper as if it were a weapon. Behind them, the carriage lamps threw long shadows across the wet street. "Your father owes Lord Grayson Pike £11,000, the tall man said. "We are here to collect. If not the money, then something else of equal value." Aloan's hands went cold. Her father, Edmund Hart, appeared behind her, his face gray, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "Papa," she whispered, "what have you done?" He did not answer. He did not need to. The cards, the late nights, the empty wine bottles that had multiplied since her mother died. She had watched it happen for 2 years and told herself it would stop. It had not stopped, and now 3 strangers stood on their doorstep speaking of debts as if her family were a ledger to be balanced. "There is another way," the tall man said, and something in his tone made Aloan's stomach twist. "Lord Grayson has taken an interest in your daughter. Marriage would settle the debt entirely." "No," Aloan said before her father could speak. "Never." The man smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Then perhaps prison suits your father better, or perhaps something worse. Lord Grayson does not like to be kept waiting." Edmund Hart's knees buckled. Aloan caught his arm before he fell, and in that moment, holding up the only parent she had left, she felt something inside her go very still and very cold. "Give us 3 days," she said. "We will find another solution." The men exchanged a glance, then left without another word. The silence they left behind was worse than their threats. That night, Aloan did not sleep. She sat by the window with a single candle and tried to think of anyone who might help. Her mother's family had cut ties years ago. Her father's friends had vanished the moment his fortune did. There was no one. Then, near dawn, a letter arrived. No messenger delivered it in the usual way. It was simply there, slipped beneath the front door, addressed to her father in handwriting so precise it looked engraved. Edmund read it twice before he handed it to her, his hands shaking. The Duke of Ashworth was offering to pay the entire debt. In exchange, he wanted a wife. He named her. Aloan had heard of the Duke of Ashworth the way one hears of ghosts and old houses. Julian Ashworth had not attended a public event in 5 years. He was said to hide behind a black glove and a high collar. Servants who worked in his house rarely spoke of him, and when they did, their voices dropped low, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Some said fire had taken half his face. Others said he had done something terrible and wore the mark of it. No one seemed to know the truth, only the rumor, and rumors had grown into something like fear. "You do not have to accept this," her father said, though his voice cracked on every word, betraying how badly he needed her to accept it anyway. Aloan looked at the letter. Then she looked at her father, a man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the market square, now reduced to a trembling shadow of debt and shame. "I will marry him," she said. She said it the way one steps off a cliff, not because the fall looks safe, but because staying still is worse. The wedding took place 6 days later in a chapel so small it barely held 20 guests. There were no flowers. There was no music beyond a single violin playing something slow and unfamiliar. Aloan wore a gown that had belonged to her mother, taken in at the waist because grief had stolen her appetite for weeks. She did not see the Duke's face until she stood beside him at the altar, and even then she saw only part of it. A high collar, a dark glove on his left hand, a hat brim pulled low enough to shade his brow. What she could see of his face was sharp and still, like a portrait of a man who had trained himself never to react to anything. He did not look at her during the vows. His voice, when he spoke them, was low and even, each word placed with the same careful precision as his handwriting. Aloan's own voice trembled through her half of the ceremony. She was aware of every eye in the room, aware of her father weeping quietly in the front pew, relief and shame mixing on his face in equal measure. When it ended, the Duke offered his gloved hand. She took it. His grip was steady, careful, as though he were afraid of holding on too tightly, or perhaps as though he were used to people flinching away from his touch. She did not flinch. She noticed distantly that she did not want to. The carriage ride to Ashworth Hall took nearly 2 hours, and for all of it, the Duke said nothing. He sat across from her, his face turned toward the window, and Aloin studied him the way one studies a locked door, searching for any seam that might reveal what lay behind it. His hands rested on his knees, and even through the glove she could see they were not soft hands. They were the hands of a man who worked or fought or both. A thin white scar crossed the base of his right thumb, old and faded. "You do not have to make conversation," he said suddenly, not turning from the window. "I know this is not the marriage you wanted." "Did you want it?" she asked, before she could stop herself. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the wheels on the road, he said, "I wanted to make sure you were safe. The marriage was simply the only way I could think to do it." She did not understand what he meant, and something in his tone told her he did not intend to explain further. She let the silence return, but the question stayed lodged in her chest like a splinter, small and impossible to ignore. Ashworth Hall rose out of the countryside like something built to keep the world out rather than welcome it in. Tall windows, most of them dark, a stone face weathered by decades of rain. The staff who greeted them at the door were polite but quiet, their eyes flicking toward the Duke and away again quickly, as though long practiced in not staring. An older woman with kind eyes and a firm mouth introduced herself as Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. She showed Aloin to a bedroom on the east wing, spacious and well-furnished, with a fire already burning in the hearth. "His Grace's chambers are down the hall," Mrs. Whitfield said carefully. "Should you need anything in the night, ring the bell by the door. Someone will come." Aloin understood, without being told directly, that the Duke would not be sharing her bed that night, or perhaps any night. She told herself this should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like one more mystery added to a growing pile. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. The Duke ate with his gloved hand resting on the table, using his other hand for his fork, and Aloin noticed he kept his face angled slightly away from the candlelight, as though managing the shadows on purpose. She tried to make conversation about the house, about the garden she had glimpsed on the drive-in, about anything that might fill the silence. He answered in short, polite sentences, offering nothing extra, closing every door she tried to open. Only once did his composure slip. She mentioned, in passing, a fire she had heard about years ago, a theater that had burned near the edge of the city. She had only meant it as idle conversation, a memory from her own past that had nothing to do with him. The Duke's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. For a single second, something crossed his face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. Then he set the fork down and excused himself from the table, citing a headache, and did not return. Aloin sat alone in the dining hall, staring at the empty chair across from her, certain she had touched something she was not meant to touch. Later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered the hall in her dressing gown, candle in hand, telling herself she was only exploring her new home. She found herself outside a door slightly ajar, light spilling from within. It was, she realized too late, the Duke's study. She should have turned back. She told herself this even as she pushed the door open another inch, even as she stepped inside. The room was lined with books and papers, orderly in a way that suggested a mind that needed control over its surroundings. On the desk sat an open drawer, and inside it, half hidden beneath a stack of letters, was a sketch. Aloin picked it up before she could stop herself. It was her, younger, perhaps 17, wearing a dress she recognized instantly because she remembered the night she had worn it, the theater, the alley behind it, The night something terrible had almost happened to her, and a stranger in the dark had stopped it before it could. She had never learned his name. She had never seen his face clearly, only a shape in the shadows, a voice telling her to run, the sound of a struggle behind her as she obeyed. She had assumed, for 5 years, that whoever saved her that night had simply vanished into the city and never thought of her again. Her hand trembled as she held the sketch. Behind her, the door creaked, and she turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his face half lit by the hall candle, his expression unreadable. "You should not be in here," he said quietly. "Who drew this?" Aloan asked, holding up the paper, her voice barely steady. "Who drew me?" The Duke did not answer. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, just for a moment, she saw something that looked almost like grief, layered over something that looked almost like relief, as though a secret he had carried for 5 years had finally, without his permission, begun to surface. "Please," she said, "tell me who you are." He crossed the room slowly, took the sketch from her hands with a gentleness that surprised her, and set it back inside the drawer, closing it with a quiet click. "Not tonight," he said. "It is not a story for tonight." He walked her back to her room himself, silent the entire way, and left her at the door with nothing but the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall and 100 new questions crowding out any hope of sleep. Aloan lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every strange moment of the day. The careful way he moved, the scar on his hand, the flinch at the mention of fire, the sketch of a girl he should never have known well enough to draw. She did not yet have the answer, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that her marriage to the Duke of Ashworth was not the accident of circumstance she had believed it to be. Somewhere in the darkness of that house, a truth was waiting for her, and she suspected, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that once she found it, nothing about her new life would ever feel simple again. Morning came with a strange calm that Aloan did not trust. She dressed slowly, her mind still turning over the sketch, the flinch at the word fire, the way the Duke had looked at her as though she were something fragile he had already broken once and could not bear to break again. At breakfast, he was there before her, already dressed, already composed, as though the night before had never happened. He greeted her with a polite nod and asked if she had slept well. She had not, and she suspected he already knew it. "You said last night was not a story for last night," she said, setting down her cup with more force than she intended. "Is it a story for this morning?" His jaw tightened. "Aloan, there are things I am not ready to explain, not because I wish to deceive you, but because some truths need the right moment. Rushing them helps no one. You drew my face 5 years before you ever proposed marriage to me," she said. "I think I have earned the right to know why." He set down his fork, and for a moment she thought he might finally answer her. Instead, a sharp knock sounded at the front door, urgent and repeated, and Mrs. Whitfield's hurried footsteps crossed the hall a moment later. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, breathless, appearing in the doorway. "There are men at the gate. They say they come on behalf of Lord Grayson Pike." The Duke's expression shifted instantly, the softness of a moment ago replaced by something sharp and alert, like a man who had trained himself for exactly this kind of interruption. "Take Aloan to the West Wing," he said to Mrs. Whitfield, already rising from the table. "Lock the doors behind her." "I am not a child to be hidden away," Aloan said, standing as well. "This concerns my father's debt. I have a right to know what is happening." "It concerns more than your father's debt," the Duke said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, trust me on this, even if you trust me on nothing else." Something in the way he said it, the raw edge beneath the calm, made her hesitate. She allowed Mrs. Whitfield to guide her toward the West Wing, though she stopped at the top of the stairs, out of sight but within hearing, and watched through a gap in the railing as the Duke crossed the entrance hall toward the front door. 3 men waited outside, the same tall man from her father's doorstep among them. Through the open door, their voices carried faintly across the stone entrance hall. "Lord Grayson sends his regards," the tall man said, his tone almost pleasant, which made it worse. "He is disappointed the young lady chose marriage over his more generous offer. He wishes to know if the arrangement might still be reconsidered for the right price." "The debt is paid," the Duke said, his voice flat and final. "My wife is not a possession to be traded a second time. Tell your master this conversation is finished." "Lord Grayson does not consider matters finished simply because he is told so," the man replied, his pleasant tone thinning at the edges. "He has a long memory, your grace, longer perhaps than you might wish." There was a pause, heavy and charged, and Eloin found herself holding her breath at the top of the stairs. "If your master sends anyone near this house again," the Duke said, each word slow and deliberate, "he will learn exactly how long my memory is as well." The men did not respond to that. A moment later, the sound of boots on gravel signaled their retreat, and the front door closed with a heavy, final thud. Eloin came down the stairs before Mrs. Whitfield could stop her, finding the Duke standing in the entrance hall, his shoulders tense, his gloved hand curled into a fist at his side. "What did he mean?" she asked. "A long memory." The Duke turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, his composure looked genuinely fragile, like a wall built quickly and under pressure, showing cracks it could not fully hide. "Lord Grayson does not simply collect debts," he said quietly. "He collects leverage. Your father's gambling was not entirely his own weakness. Grayson encouraged it, funded it in ways your father never noticed, all so that eventually he would own something your father could not refuse to give up." Eloin's stomach turned. "He wanted me all along." "Yes," the Duke said, "and I could not let that happen." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter so much to you what happens to me?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the same conflict she had seen the night before, grief and relief tangled together behind careful eyes. He opened his mouth as though he might finally answer her, and then, as before, he stopped himself. "Not today," he said, "but soon, I promise you that." She wanted to press further, but exhaustion and fear had worn her down, and she let the subject rest, though it sat heavy in her chest for the rest of the day. That evening, the household settled into an uneasy quiet. Eloin found herself restless, wandering the gardens as the sun set, needing air, needing space away from the weight of unanswered questions. The gardens at Ashworth Hall were larger than she expected, hedged paths winding between old stone fountains, most of them dry and cracked with age. She had walked perhaps 10 minutes before she noticed the smell of smoke. At first she thought little of it, a gardener's fire perhaps, or a chimney nearby. But the smell grew stronger, sharper, and when she rounded a hedge near the old greenhouse at the edge of the property, she saw flames licking up one wall, orange light flickering against the darkening sky. She screamed for help before she had even fully processed what she was seeing, and within moments, servants came running from the house, buckets in hand, forming a chain toward the well. The Duke arrived faster than anyone, and Eloin watched, frozen, as he ran directly toward the burning building without hesitation, without the careful, controlled movements she had come to expect from him. He tore his glove off as he ran, revealing scarred skin beneath, and threw open the greenhouse door. "There is no one inside," someone shouted. "Your Grace, wait." He did not wait. He disappeared into the smoke, and for the longest 30 seconds of Eloin's life, she stood rooted to the ground, certain she was about to lose the husband she barely knew, and yet somehow already could not imagine losing. He emerged coughing, dragging an unconscious under-gardener boy by the collar, both of them soot-streaked and gasping. The servants surged forward to help, pulling them clear as the greenhouse roof collapsed inward with a groan of breaking timber. Eloin ran to him without thinking, dropping to her knees beside him as he knelt in the grass, chest heaving. His bare hand pressed flat against the earth, as though grounding himself against something only he could feel. "You could have died," she said, her voice shaking. "I have run into fire before," he said quietly, still catching his breath. "I did not intend to let it take anyone else." Something about the way he said anyone else made her chest tighten. She reached for his bare hand before she could think better of it, and he flinched, not away from pain, but as though the touch itself startled him, as though he had not expected anyone to reach for that hand willingly. She did not let go. His skin was rough with old scarring along the back of his hand and wrist, the same hand that had always worn a glove, and she understood, finally, without needing him to explain, that the fire tonight had touched something far older than the greenhouse. "Julian," she said, his given name feeling strange and intimate in her mouth for the first time. "Tell me what happened to you." He looked at her, soot on his cheek, his composed mask finally fully broken, and for a long moment she thought he might actually answer. Instead, Mrs. Whitfield arrived with blankets and urgent instructions, and the moment dissolved into the chaos of tending the injured boy and confirming the fire had not spread further. By the time the greenhouse had been reduced to smoldering ruins and the household had quieted again, the Duke had retreated behind his composure once more, and Aloan was left with nothing but the memory of his bare hand beneath hers and the certainty that whatever secret he carried, it was burning him from the inside far worse than any fire ever could. 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. The Duke kept largely to his study, emerging only for meals, his manner polite but distant, as though the greenhouse fire had frightened him back behind his walls rather than through them. Aloan did not push. She had learned in her short time at Ashworth Hall that pushing only made him retreat further. Instead, she used the quiet to explore the house properly, and to speak with the staff, carefully, gently, gathering pieces of a story no one seemed willing to tell her directly. Mrs. Whitfield was the most forthcoming, though even she chose her words with visible caution. "His Grace was not always like this," she said one afternoon, as they folded linens together in the laundry room, a task Aloan had insisted on helping with simply to have something to occupy her hands. 5 years ago he traveled often, attended every ball in the city, laughed easily. Then there was an accident, and he came home a different man. "What kind of accident?" Aloan asked. Mrs. Whitfield's hand stilled on the fabric. "That is not mine to tell, my lady. I am sorry, but I will say this. Whatever happened that night, he has never once complained of the pain it left him. He speaks only of what he could not save." The words settled into Aloan like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood. That night, unable to sleep again, she found herself once more outside the study door, drawn by candlelight spilling into the hall. This time, the door stood fully open, as though he had been waiting for her, or had simply stopped trying to keep her out. He sat at his desk, the sketch of her from years ago spread out before him alongside another paper, one she had not seen before. She stepped inside quietly, and he did not look up immediately, though he must have heard her. "5 years ago," he said finally, still looking down at the papers, "I was walking home late from a friend's townhouse when I heard a struggle in an alley near the old Faircross Theater. A young man had cornered a girl, and things were about to go very badly for her." Aloan's breath caught in her throat. She knew this story. She had lived this story. "I intervened," he continued. "There was a fight. The man had a lantern, and in the struggle it broke and caught the alley debris alight. The fire spread faster than either of us expected. I got the girl clear, but by the time I turned back for the man responsible, the flames had already trapped him inside a collapsed section of the theater's side entrance. I tried to reach him. I could not. The fire took my face instead and took him entirely." Aloan's hand rose slowly to her mouth. "That was me," she whispered. "That night, that was me in the alley." The Duke finally looked up, and in his eyes she saw 5 years of carried guilt finally fully exposed. "I know," he said. "I have known since the moment I first saw you again at a distance, months ago, at a market you did not know I attended. I recognized you instantly. I drew your face that night from memory because I could not stop thinking about whether you had survived, whether you were safe, whether the fire that took my face had at least bought you a future worth living." "You never came forward," Aloan said, her voice trembling. "You never told anyone. You let me believe a stranger had simply vanished." "I did not want gratitude," he said quietly. "I did not want anyone looking at what the fire left behind and calling it heroism. I wanted only to know you were safe from a distance without asking anything of you in return." "Then why the marriage?" she asked. "If you wanted nothing from me, why arrange all of this?" "Because Grayson found out," he said, his voice hardening. "Somehow, he learned the truth about that night, learned that you were the girl from the alley, and he began circling your father's debts like a man who finally saw a use for you beyond simple leverage. I could not stand by and watch him claim what the fire had already cost me so much to protect." The room fell silent, filled only with the crackle of the fireplace and the weight of 5 years finally spoken aloud. Aloan crossed the room slowly and knelt beside his chair, so that she could see his face without the shadows he so carefully arranged around himself. "You have been protecting me since before I ever knew your name," she said softly. "Yes," he admitted. "And you never once thought I deserved to know that." "I thought," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "that you deserved a life untouched by what happened that night. Not a debt to repay, not a stranger's face haunting your dreams. I wanted to give you distance, not obligation." Aloan reached up and for the first time touched the scarred side of his face, the side he always kept turned away from candlelight. He flinched, as he always did, but this time he did not pull back. "I am not looking at obligation," she said. "I am looking at the man who ran into fire twice to keep me safe and never once asked for anything in return. That is not a stranger to me, Julian. That has not been a stranger for a very long time." He closed his eyes briefly, as though her words cost him something he had not expected to survive, and when he opened them again, something in his careful composure had softened, just slightly, just enough. But even as the moment settled between them, warm and fragile, Aloan could not shake the memory of Lord Grayson's man standing at the gate, speaking of long memories and unfinished business. Whatever peace this confession had bought them, she suspected it would not last long, not with a man like Grayson still circling, and not with secrets this large finally loose in the world. 3 weeks passed, and for a while Ashworth Hall settled into something Aloan had never expected to find there: peace. The Duke, who now asked her to call him Julian in private, began joining her for walks in the garden each morning. He spoke more freely, laughed rarely but genuinely when he did, and no longer angled his scarred cheek away from the light when they sat together in the evenings. Aloan found herself, against every expectation she had carried into this marriage, falling for the man behind the scars. But peace, she was learning, had a way of being temporary in a house built on secrets. It began with a letter. No signature, no seal, delivered the same way the marriage proposal had been delivered weeks before, slipped beneath the front door in the gray hours before dawn. Mrs. Whitfield found it first and brought it directly to the Duke, her face pale. Aloan was present when he opened it, and she watched the color drain from his face as he read the single line written inside. "You did not finish the job. I have had 5 years to plan how I will finish it for you." "Julian," Aloan said, alarm rising in her chest, "what does it mean?" He set the letter down slowly, his hand not entirely steady. "It means I was wrong," he said. "The man in the alley, the one I believed died in the fire, he did not die." Aloan felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Silas," she whispered, a name she had never spoken aloud to anyone, a name she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself she imagined it. I heard him say his name that night, right before you pulled me away. Silas. Silas Vane, the Duke confirmed grimly. I searched for records after the fire years ago, hoping to learn who I had failed to save. I found nothing, no family claiming a body, no name in any registry. I assumed the fire had taken everything, even his identity. I should have looked harder. If he survived, Aloan said, her voice trembling, then he has spent 5 years knowing exactly who I am, watching, waiting. And now he knows where to find you, Julian said, standing abruptly, already moving toward the window, scanning the gray morning light beyond the glass as though the threat might already be standing in the garden. Grayson's men were not simply collecting a debt weeks ago. I believe Vane has been using Grayson's greed as a way to track you without revealing himself directly. Grayson may not even know the full truth of who he has been working alongside. We have to go to the authorities, Aloan said. I have already tried, quietly, since the greenhouse fire, Julian admitted. There is no proof strong enough to act on. A man presumed dead cannot easily be accused of anything. We need him to show himself before anyone will believe the danger is real. Aloan wrapped her arms around herself, chilled despite the fire burning in the hearth nearby. Then what do? We do not wait for him to choose the moment, Julian said, his expression hardening into something Aloan had not seen from him before, sharp and decisive, the calm precision of a man who had spent 5 years quietly preparing for exactly this possibility, even if he had not known it. I will send word to Captain Rowan Ellis, a friend from my years in the city, a man with connections in the constabulary who owes me a debt of his own. If Vane wants to finish what he started, we will make certain he walks into a trap of our making, not the other way around. For the rest of that day, the household moved with a tension Aloan had not felt since her arrival. Extra locks were fitted to the doors. Staff were instructed not to admit any visitor without the Duke's direct approval. Aloan was asked not to walk the gardens alone, a request she accepted without argument, though the confinement chafed against her nerves within hours. Before Ellis arrived, Julian pulled Aloan aside into the small armory room at the back of the house, a room she had not known existed until that morning. Old blades hung along one wall, alongside a pair of dueling pistols kept polished despite years of disuse. I cannot promise you will never need to defend yourself before this is over, Julian said, his voice low and serious. I would rather teach you now in safety than regret not doing so later. He showed her how to hold a small blade properly, how to break free of a wrist grip, how to aim a pistol steady even with trembling hands. Aloan's fingers fumbled at first, unused to the weight of the weapons, but Julian's patience never wavered, his hands guiding hers gently, correcting her stance without ever making her feel foolish for needing the lesson at all. You learn quickly, he said, after she managed to disarm him twice in a row during a slow, careful practice grip. I have excellent motivation, she said, though her voice shook slightly at the thought of why the lesson was necessary in the first place. He set down the practice blade and studied her for a long moment, something tender breaking through his usual watchfulness. I am sorry, he said quietly, that my past has become a danger you must now carry as well. You did not choose to be attacked in an alley 5 years ago, Aloan said. Neither did I. We are simply the two people left standing after someone else chose cruelty. I do not blame you for that, Julian. I never have. He said nothing in reply, only reached for her hand, pressing it briefly, wordlessly, before the sound of hooves on the gravel drive outside announced Ellis's arrival, and pulled them both back toward the urgent business of survival. Captain Ellis arrived by evening, a broad-shouldered man with a steady gaze and the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to danger. He listened to the full account without interrupting, studied the letter carefully, and finally set it down with a grim nod. If this man has spent 5 years planning, Ellis said, then he will not act carelessly. He will wait for a moment when the house feels safest, when your guard has lowered even slightly. We must not give him that moment. What do you suggest? Julian asked. A controlled opportunity, Ellis said. Something that looks like a lapse in your defenses but is not. Somewhere we can watch and wait without him knowing we are watching at all. The plan they devised over the following days made Aloan's stomach twist every time she thought of it. She would attend a small charity gathering in the city, one of the few public events the Duke had agreed to appear at since his return from the fire years ago, an event announced publicly enough that Vane would certainly hear of it if he was watching them as closely as the letter suggested. Julian would remain visibly at her side for most of the evening, and then, at a carefully chosen moment, would appear to step away, leaving Aloan seemingly unguarded near a private garden terrace at the edge of the venue. Ellis and two of his most trusted men would be stationed out of sight nearby, ready to close in the moment Vane revealed himself. Aloan hated the plan, hated the idea of standing as bait even for a few controlled minutes, but she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that waiting for Vane to choose his own moment would be far more dangerous than choosing one for him. The night of the gathering arrived with a tension that made every candle flame in the ballroom feel too bright, every conversation too loud. Aloan wore a gown of deep blue, chosen deliberately for how well it would show against the pale terrace stone if anything went wrong, a detail Ellis had suggested with a grim practicality that had made her hands shake as she dressed. Julian stayed close beside her for the first hour, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a silent reassurance amid the swirl of curious guests who had clearly not expected the reclusive Duke to appear at all, let alone with a new wife on his arm. Whispers followed them through the room, but Aloan found she did not care, not with the real danger of the evening pressing so heavily against her thoughts. At the agreed moment, Julian excused himself with practiced casualness, claiming a need to speak briefly with an old acquaintance across the room. Aloan watched him go, her heart hammering, and made her way, as planned, toward the quiet terrace at the garden's edge, where the noise of the ballroom faded into the cool hush of night air and distant crickets. She counted her own breaths to steady herself. 1, 2, 3. The terrace door creaked softly behind her. She turned, expecting perhaps a servant, perhaps nothing at all, and found herself facing a man she had never seen clearly, not once, not even 5 years ago in the dark of that alley. But she knew him instantly, the way one knows a nightmare returning by feeling alone. Half of his face bore scars far more severe than Julian's, pale and twisted in the moonlight, the mark of a fire that had clearly taken far more from him than it had taken from the Duke. His eyes, though, were the worst part, calm and patient in a way that made her skin crawl. Aloan Hart, he said softly, savoring the name. 5 years, and I finally get to see the face I only heard screaming in the dark. Silas Vane, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice even as every instinct urged her to run. His smile was slow and terrible. You remember my name. I am flattered. I have thought of little else besides you and your husband's face for 5 long years. Do you know what it is like to lie in agony for months, listening to physicians whisper that you will never look human again, and to know exactly whose choice put you there? He tried to save you, Aloan said. You attacked me first. Details, Vane said dismissively, stepping closer, and Aloan forced herself to hold her ground, trusting the plan, trusting that Ellis's men were watching, that this moment had been chosen precisely so it would not end the way Vane intended. I did not come tonight for details. I came to finish what your husband so rudely interrupted 5 years ago, and then perhaps to let him watch what remains before I finish him as well. He moved fast, faster than Aloan expected, closing the distance between them in a single stride, his hand closing hard around her wrist. She cried out, twisting against his grip, and in the same instant shapes moved fast from the shadows at the terrace's edge, Ellis and his men closing in exactly as planned. But Vane had planned as well. A second figure emerged from the darkness behind him, one of Grayson's men, and threw something small and metallic to the stone floor between them, a device that hissed and burst into a sudden, blinding cloud of smoke and sparks. Aloan screamed as the world dissolved into chaos, shouts and coughing, and the scrape of struggling bodies somewhere in the thickening smoke. Vane's grip on her wrist did not loosen, and she felt herself being dragged backward, away from the terrace, toward the dark hedges beyond. "Julian!" she screamed into the smoke, praying her voice would carry over the confusion. It did. A shape crashed through the smoke, moving with none of the Duke's usual careful precision, only raw, desperate speed. Julian slammed into Vane with the full force of his body, breaking the man's grip on Aloan's wrist and sending both men tumbling hard against the stone terrace floor. Aloan scrambled back, coughing, her eyes streaming from the smoke, and watched in horror as the two men grappled fiercely near the terrace edge, 5 years of guilt and rage finally colliding in the flesh. "You should have let me die properly the first time," Vane snarled, landing a hard blow across Julian's scarred cheek that made Aloan cry out again. "Instead you left me half a man, and I have spent every day since deciding exactly how I would return the favor." "I did not leave you," Julian ground out, forcing Vane's arm away from his throat with a strength born of pure desperation. "I could not reach you. There is a difference, and I have carried that difference every single day since." The smoke began to clear enough for Aloan to see Ellis and his men finally breaking through, weapons drawn, closing the remaining distance fast. Vane saw them too, and something calculating flickered behind his damaged eyes. "This is not finished," he snarled, and with a final vicious shove that sent Julian sprawling backward, he turned and ran, vaulting the low garden wall at the terrace's edge and disappearing into the darkness of the surrounding hedges before Ellis's men could close the gap. Ellis barked orders, sending 2 men in pursuit, though Aloan already suspected, watching the darkness swallow Vane whole, that the chase would end in failure. A man who had planned for 5 years would not be caught so easily on the very night his plan first failed. Julian pushed himself up from the stone floor, breathing hard, blood at the corner of his mouth from Vane's blow, and immediately crossed to Aloan, his hands moving over her shoulders, her arms, checking for injury with a desperation that betrayed exactly how frightened he had been. "I am unhurt," she said quickly, though her voice shook badly enough to undercut the claim. "Julian, he knew everything. He has been planning this for years." "I know," Julian said grimly, pulling her against his chest, and for once she let herself lean fully into him, shaking, the adrenaline of the last few minutes finally catching up to her all at once. "And now he knows we are prepared to fight back. That makes him more dangerous, not less." Ellis returned a short while later, his expression grim, confirming what Aloan had already feared. Vane had vanished completely into the city's darker streets, leaving no trail his men could follow. "He will not try something so public again," Ellis said. "Next time he will come for you somewhere quieter, somewhere he believes he has the advantage." "Then we do not give him the chance," Julian said, his arms still tight around Aloan's shoulders, his jaw set with a hard, protective resolve she had not seen in him before, not even during the greenhouse fire. "Whatever it takes, I will not let him near her again." Aloan believed him. She had to. But as they returned to the carriage that night, the taste of smoke still bitter in her throat, the memory of Vane's calm, patient eyes still burning behind her own, she understood with a cold certainty that the danger circling their marriage had only just begun to show its true shape, and that the coming days would demand far more from both of them than either had yet been asked to give. For the following week, Ashworth Hall felt less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. Julian doubled the number of guards at every entrance, hired 2 additional men on Ellis's recommendation to watch the grounds through the night, and refused to let Aloan out of sight for more than a few minutes at a time. She understood the necessity, even welcomed it in her more frightened moments, but the constant vigilance wore at her nerves until even the creak of an old floorboard made her flinch. Word came from the city that Lord Grayson Pike had suddenly grown eager to distance himself from the entire affair, sending a hastily written letter denying any knowledge of Silas Vane's true intentions and offering to forgive what remained of Edmund Hart's debt entirely, provided the matter was never spoken of publicly. Julian suspected the man had simply realized, belatedly, that he had allied himself with someone far more dangerous than a convenient source of leverage, and wanted no part of whatever came next. "That leaves your father safe from Grayson, at least," Julian said, reading the letter aloud to Aloan over breakfast. "But it does nothing to protect him from Vane, if Vane decides your father makes a useful way to reach you." The thought had already occurred to Aloan, and it kept her awake at night far more than her own safety did. Her father, alone in his small townhouse in the city, with none of the protection Ashworth Hall now offered. "We should bring him here," she said, "at least until this is resolved." Julian agreed without hesitation, and arrangements were made that same day. But the message sent to fetch Edmund Hart returned only a servant's boy, breathless and frightened, with news that turned Aloan's blood to ice. Her father was gone. The townhouse showed signs of a struggle, an overturned chair, a shattered lamp, and no trace of Edmund himself beyond a single scrap of paper left deliberately on the kitchen table, weighted down by a knife driven through its center. Julian read it first, his face going pale in a way Aloan had never seen, and when he finally handed it to her, his hand was not steady at all. "Bring yourself to the old Faircross Theatre ruins by midnight, alone, and your father lives. Bring anyone else, and I will make certain you watch him burn, the way I should have watched your husband burn 5 years ago before he interfered." Aloan's knees nearly gave out beneath her. Julian caught her before she could fall, guiding her to a chair, his own composure fraying visibly at the edges. "He will not have your father alone," Julian said. "Men like Vane do not work without leverage of their own. He knows the theater ruins better than anyone, knows every hidden entrance and collapsed passage. He has chosen ground that favors him completely." "I have to go," Aloan said immediately. "Julian, he has my father." "If you go alone, he will kill you both anyway once he has what he wants," Julian said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We need Ellis. We need a plan, not blind obedience to a madman's demands." "There is no time for a plan that takes longer than the hours we have left before midnight," Aloan said, standing despite her shaking legs. "I will not sit here and let my father die because we were too careful to act." They compromised, though it satisfied neither of them fully. Ellis was summoned immediately, and while his men moved quietly toward the theater ruins ahead of the appointed hour, working to identify Vane's likely position without revealing themselves, Aloan prepared to approach the ruins as instructed, alone in appearance, though never truly alone, with Julian and 2 of Ellis's most capable men shadowing her path through the darkened city streets, staying just far enough back to remain unseen. The Faircross Theatre ruins rose against the night sky like the blackened ribs of some long-dead animal. Walls collapsed in places, the old stage still visible through a gap where the roof had fallen away entirely 5 years before. Aloan approached alone across the rubble-strewn courtyard, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard from a distance, every shadow suddenly capable of hiding Vane's damaged, patient face. "You came," Vane's voice called out from somewhere within the ruins, echoing strangely off the broken walls. "Alone, as instructed. How touching the loyalty a good man's face can buy." "Where is my father?" Aloan called back, forcing steel into her voice despite the terror clawing up her throat. "Safe enough for now," Vane said, and a moment later he emerged from the shadows near what remained of the old stage, dragging Edmund Hart by the collar, the older man bound and gagged. His eyes wide with fear above the cloth covering his mouth. Whether he remains that way depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes. Let him go, Aloan said. I am here. You have what you wanted. Not quite everything, Vane said, his damaged smile stretching wide in the moonlight. I want your husband to watch this time. I want him to feel exactly what helplessness costs, the way I felt it, trapped and burning while he chose to save you instead of me. He tried to save you both, Aloan said. You are the one who started that fire, Silas, not him. Details, Vane said again, the same dismissive word he had used on the terrace, and Aloan understood with chilling clarity that the man standing before her had rewritten the truth so many times in his own mind that no version of reality could touch the story he had built to justify his rage. A sound from the shadows behind Vane, a shifting of loose stone, drew his attention for half a second, just long enough for Julian to emerge fully into the moonlit courtyard, no longer hiding, his expression carved from pure, controlled fury. Then look at me, Julian said, stepping forward slowly, deliberately drawing Vane's attention away from Aloan and her bound father. You wanted me to watch. Very well, I am watching, but you will let them go first. Vane's damaged eyes narrowed, calculating. You always did think yourself noble, he said, trading yourself for others. It did not save your face 5 years ago. It will not save anyone tonight. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Aloan would spend days afterward trying to piece the sequence back together in her memory. Ellis's men, positioned exactly where the shadows had hidden them, moved the instant Vane's focus shifted fully to Julian, closing in from 2 directions at once. Vane, sensing the trap too late, shoved Edmund Hart hard toward a jagged section of broken flooring, and lunged instead toward Julian with a length of iron pipe he had kept hidden along his side. Julian met the attack head-on, catching the first blow across his forearm with a grunt of pain but managing to drive his shoulder hard into Vane's chest, sending both men crashing against a half-collapsed pillar. Aloan ran for her father, tearing frantically at the ropes binding his wrists as the sounds of struggle continued behind her, iron striking stone, ragged breathing, the desperate scrape of boots against rubble. Aloan, go, her father gasped the moment the gag came free, his voice hoarse with fear. Get away from here. She would not leave, not with Julian still fighting for his life only a few yards away. She turned in time to see Vane land a vicious blow that sent Julian staggering back toward the edge of a collapsed section of flooring, the old theater's basement level yawning open just beyond, a drop of at least 15 feet into darkness and broken timber. Julian, she screamed. He caught himself just short of the edge, boots skidding against loose stone, and in the half-second Vane took to close the distance for what would surely have been a finishing blow, Ellis's men reached him at last, one tackling him hard from behind while the other wrestled the iron pipe from his grip. Vane fought with a wild, desperate strength that took 3 men to finally subdue, screaming curses and half-formed threats even as they forced him to the ground and bound his wrists behind his back. Aloan watched, shaking, her father's freed hand gripping hers tightly, as the man who had haunted 5 years of her nightmares was finally, completely restrained. Julian limped toward them across the rubble, favoring his injured arm, blood trickling from a cut above his brow, but alive, whole enough, standing. Aloan released her father's hand and closed the remaining distance in a rush, wrapping her arms around Julian before he could say a single word, feeling the frantic pounding of his heart beneath her cheek, matching the pace of her own. You are safe, he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. You are both safe. You could have died, she said again, the same words she had spoken after the greenhouse fire, though this time they carried the full weight of everything that had grown between them in the weeks since. Do not ever do that again. I made a promise to protect you the night I pulled you out of this very alley 5 years ago, Julian said quietly, pulling back just enough to look at her properly, his scarred face fully visible in the moonlight, fully unguarded for perhaps the first time since she had known him. I intend to keep that promise for as long as I am given the chance to. Ellis approached a moment later, confirming Vane was secured, and would be handed over to the proper authorities before dawn. The years of doubt about his survival finally resolved into hard, undeniable proof that would keep him confined for good this time. Edmund Hart, shaken but unharmed, thanked Julian with tears in his eyes, gripping his hand with a gratitude that needed no further words. As the theater ruins finally quieted around them, the danger that had shadowed their marriage from its very first day at last brought fully into the light. Elowen allowed herself, for the first time since the wedding 6 weeks before, to imagine a future that did not involve secrets or threats or fire. She looked up at Julian, at the scarred face she had once feared and now could not imagine her life without, and understood that whatever had begun as a forced arrangement born of debt and desperation had somewhere along the way become something else entirely, something neither of them had expected, and something she was no longer willing to let go of, no matter what challenges still waited beyond that night. The days that followed the theater ruins moved slowly, in the strange, muted way that follows any great danger once it has finally passed. Sela's vein was delivered into the custody of the city magistrate before sunrise, and within a week, sworn statements from Elowen, from Edmund Hart, from Ellis and his men, and from Julian himself built a case so complete that no lawyer could argue Vane back into freedom. He was sentenced to a prison far from the city, its walls thick enough that Elowen finally allowed herself to stop glancing over her shoulder every time she stepped into a garden or crossed a darkened room. Lord Grayson Pike fared little better, though his punishment came in quieter form. Word spread quickly through the city's drawing rooms of his careless entanglement, with a man now proven to be both an arsonist and a kidnapper, and the doors that had once opened easily to a wealthy lord began closing, one by one, until Grayson found himself as isolated by scandal as Julian had once been by scars. Elowen felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a distant, weary relief that he would trouble her family no further. Edmund Hart, freed entirely of his debts and shaken deeply by how close his weakness had come to costing his daughter everything, made a choice Elowen had not expected. He sold what remained of his townhouse in the city and took a small cottage near the coast, away from the card tables and the friends who had encouraged his ruin, determined, he said, to spend whatever years he had left proving himself worthy of the daughter who had nearly paid for his mistakes with her life. "I do not deserve the family you have built here," he told Elowen, during one of his first visits to Ashworth Hall after everything had settled, standing awkwardly in the same entrance hall where Julian had once faced down Grayson's men. "But I hope, in time, I might earn a small place in it again." Elowen embraced her father tightly, tears in her eyes, and told him that hope was more than enough to begin with. At Ashworth Hall itself, something had shifted permanently in the weeks since the ruins, something neither Elowen nor Julian spoke of directly, but both felt in every quiet moment they now shared. He no longer wore the glove at all, not even when guests visited, and though Elowen occasionally caught him beginning the old habit of turning his scarred cheek from the light, he stopped himself more often than not, choosing instead to simply let himself be seen. One evening, several weeks after Vane's sentencing, Elowen found Julian in the garden rather than his study, sitting on the stone bench near the fountain that had finally been repaired and set flowing again after years of standing dry and cracked. He held 2 cups of tea, one already gone lukewarm, as though he had poured it out of habit for a version of her that no longer needed to be sought out in quiet, uncertain moments. She sat beside him without a word, close enough that their shoulders touched, and took the cooling cup from his hand. "I used to sit here alone most evenings," he said quietly, watching the water catch the last light of sunset. "I told myself I preferred the silence. I think, in truth, I had simply convinced myself I did not deserve anything louder." "And now," Elowen asked. "Now I find the silence unbearable the moment you leave the room," he admitted, a small, unguarded smile touching the corner of his mouth, one she had come to treasure more than any grand declaration could have offered. I did not expect that when I arranged this marriage. I expected duty. I expected distance, kept carefully, the way I have kept distance from everyone since the fire. And instead, she pressed gently. Instead, I find I have fallen in love with my own wife, he said, the words simple and unadorned, offered without the careful precision he usually applied to everything he said, as though for once he had let himself speak before he could measure the risk, which was never part of the arrangement, and which terrifies me rather more than Sela's Vane ever managed to. Aloan laughed, a bright, surprised sound that seemed to startle them both after so many weeks weighted down by fear. I believe, she said, setting her cup aside and turning to face him fully, that I fell in love with you somewhere between the greenhouse fire and the moment you told me the truth in your study. I have simply been waiting for you to catch up. Then I am glad, Julian said, reaching for her hand, his bare fingers, scarred and steady, closing around hers without hesitation, that I did not keep you waiting indefinitely. He kissed her then, gently, there in the garden beside the newly flowing fountain, and Aloan felt something settle inside her that had been unsteady since the very first knock on her father's door weeks before, a certainty that whatever had begun as a desperate bargain to escape one danger had grown, through fire and fear, and finally through trust, into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Life at Ashworth Hall in the months that followed bore little resemblance to the tense, secretive household Aloan had first arrived at. The staff, sensing the change in their master, grew warmer and more open in turn. Mrs. Whitfield took to humming while she worked, something Aloan learned had not happened in the house for 5 long years. Guests, cautiously at first and then with growing regularity, began accepting invitations to small dinners Julian now hosted without hesitation. His scars no longer a secret kept behind closed doors, but simply a part of the man everyone had come to know and increasingly to respect. Captain Ellis remained a frequent visitor, and Aloan suspected, from the way Mrs. Whitfield's daughter blushed whenever he called, that his visits might not remain purely professional for much longer. Edmund Hart wrote regularly from his coastal cottage, his letters growing steadier and more hopeful with each passing month, filled with small, ordinary joys, fishing trips and garden vegetables, and a neighbor's friendly dog, the quiet contentment of a man finally free of the weight that had nearly destroyed everything he loved. The magistrate's hearing, held some weeks before Grayson's social ruin was complete, brought Aloan face to face with Sela's Vane one final time, though this time under conditions she controlled entirely. She stood in the small, wood-paneled courtroom and gave her account clearly, steadily, without a single tremor in her voice, while Vane sat bound between 2 guards, his damaged eyes fixed on her the entire time with an intensity that once would have frozen her where she stood. It did not freeze her now. "You wanted me to be afraid forever," she told him, when the magistrate allowed her a final statement. "You have had 5 years to plan my fear, and I have had only a few months to decide I would not give it to you. I find I prefer my choice." Vane said nothing, his jaw working silently, and when the magistrate read the sentence confining him to a distant prison for the remainder of his natural life, Aloan felt no triumph, only a quiet, settling relief, the closing of a door she had not realized remained open until it finally shut. Julian took her hand as they left the courtroom, and neither of them looked back. Life slowly wove itself back into ordinary shapes after that. Captain Ellis, true to Aloan's earlier suspicion, began finding increasingly frequent reasons to call at Ashworth Hall even after the danger had fully passed, and it was not long before Mrs. Whitfield's daughter, a bright, quick-witted young woman named Beatrice, could be found laughing with him in the kitchen garden more evenings than not. Mrs. Whitfield pretended not to notice, though the extra care she took over the tea tray whenever the captain visited told a different story entirely. Aloan found herself, in those quiet months, learning the rhythms of a household finally at peace. She took over the management of the gardens herself, replanting the beds near the repaired fountain with flowers her mother had once grown, small yellow blooms that reminded her of childhood mornings long before cards and debt had darkened her family's door. Julian often found her there in the late afternoons, soil on her hands, sunlight catching the loose strands of her hair, and he took to joining her without being asked, learning slowly, clumsily, how to coax a garden bed into order, a task entirely unlike anything his careful, controlled life had prepared him for. "You are terrible at this," she told him once, laughing, as he uprooted a young seedling by mistake for the third time in an hour. "I have spent 5 years perfecting stillness," he said, feigning offense, though his eyes were warm with amusement. "No one warned me gardening required this much decisive violence against small plants." She laughed harder at that, and he watched her laugh with an open, unguarded fondness that had become, in the months since the theater ruins, entirely ordinary between them, though it never once stopped feeling like a small miracle to either of them. Nearly a year after the wedding that had begun in cold silence and near strangers' vows, Julian and Eloan held a second ceremony at Ashworth Hall, small and quiet as the first had been, but utterly different in every way that mattered. This time, Julian stood facing her fully in the candlelight, his scarred cheek turned toward the gathered guests without hesitation, without shame. This time, his voice did not waver with careful distance as he spoke his vows, but instead carried a warmth Eloan had once feared she would never hear directed at her. This time when he took her hand, his grip was not careful or restrained, but sure, steady, and entirely his own, offered freely to a woman he no longer needed to protect from a distance, because she stood beside him now, fully seen and fully chosen, in a marriage that had somehow transformed itself from a debt paid into a life built, deliberately and completely together. Standing in the garden afterward, surrounded by the small gathering of people who had become, in the strangest and most difficult of circumstances, something like family, Eloan looked up at her husband and understood, with a certainty that no fire, no threat, and no scar could ever diminish, that she had not simply survived the danger that once surrounded her. She had found, in the man who had silently protected her long before she ever knew his name, a home worth every difficult step it had taken to reach it.